Ed, welcome. Head of Tax for Cinven. How long have you been with Cinven for, Ed?
I've been with Cinven for about 5 years.
5 years. And where are you from originally?
Geographically, or?
Where in the world, sir? Are you same country as me?
So I'm from the UK. I grew up in Wales, and I moved to London to go to university, and then I never left.
Fantastic. Welcome, sir. Welcome. Giuliano Bidoli, the Director for Tax and Finance for BC Partners. Giuliano, in your typical day, just tell us, what are 3 things that you normally do?
Tax, cash, and coordination.
Fantastic. By the way, gentlemen, all of you, you need to hold your microphones really close to your mouth when you're speaking. Keith, welcome. I know that you've been in Luxembourg a long time. Today, you are representing as president of the International Fiscal Association, Luxembourg. Who are they?
I was going to say to its members, it's the most important organization in Luxembourg. To the rest of Luxembourg, it's probably up there with the Undertakers Convention or something like that, an organization you want to stay clear of. But basically, IFA globally is tax experts all around the world, academics, governments, professionals, and there's a chapter in Luxembourg, and I chair that.
Fantastic. Welcome, gentlemen. Keith, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So, welcome everyone, and this is a panel with 3 people on it who are heavily involved in tax, which, if you weren't aware of this and you want to flee the room, feel free. If not, I'll presume you're here intentionally, in which case we're very glad. But actually, we're talking about carried interest more broadly. So we're going to discuss it in 3 parts. First of all, we will discuss what carried interest means within private equity firms from an operational perspective. And we look at some questions like, why does it even exist? You know, why? Secondly, is it effective? You know, what is it effective at? Is it good for LPs who, you know, ultimately pay it? Is it good for the teams? You know, does it actually work? So we look at some questions like that. Then we'll move on to, as some of you know, there's recently been a new draft law in Luxembourg that's come out. We'll look at that new law. And then we'll consider how that fits in an international context and what the potential implications are. So when I was preparing for this and I was trying to take off my tax hat, as a kind of research-based organization, I thought I should do some research around carried interest and see what was out there. And it was interesting, and this may explain why, talking about carried interest, there's 3 tax people on the panel. But if you look at academic research around carried interest, roughly speaking, you find 9 papers dealing with tax policy and 1 paper dealing with the economics of this, which I was actually blown away by, because I thought the other side of it was far more interesting. But if you look at the academic research, there's relatively limited amount of it, but what it does tend to support is that, first of all, the existence of carried interest tends to have, it correlates with strong investment performance.
The thing is, I'm a bit.
Secondly, in terms of team retention, it tends to create strong team retention. And there are papers around this, not a lot of them. And I think part of the reason there aren't a lot of them is that by nature it's a private industry, so the data for academic researchers isn't that widely available. But it does tend to support the thesis that it's useful both from an LP perspective and from a GP perspective. And as one of my partners said when we were discussing these, he says, well, that's bloody obvious, otherwise it wouldn't exist. But you know, maybe that's a big presumption. And with that, I'd like to maybe first of all get Ed and Giuliano to talk a little bit about, first of all, their firms, and secondly, in their day jobs, what does carry kind of mean and what effects does it have? Ed, do you want to start?
Sure, thanks, Keith. So a little bit about Cinven. I promise not to go on too long about Cinven. I think I could probably fill the time just doing that. So Cinven, we're a private equity firm, large private equity firm. We're focused on quite traditional private equity buyout deals. We've been around a long time. Our most recent fund was Fund 8 that we raised a few years ago. and that hit its hard cap of 12.75 billion. And effectively what we do is we raise these pools of capital, and we would invest in portfolio companies. Typically it will be 15 to 20 portfolio companies that will go into a fund. And it's a cycle where you go out and fundraise to get that pool of capital. You then deploy the fund, which probably 3 to 5 years, and then you're kind of more into a realizations phase. And I mention all that, you probably know it all already, but I mention all that because our carried interest model is a whole of fund carried interest model. And that means that the carried interest, if the fund is successful, would pay out in that later realizations period. So it is a very long-term incentive and asset. And yes, Cinven's only focused on private equity. That's all we do. We don't do anything else. We don't do debt. We don't do other strategies. We operate in 7 main jurisdictions, which I will name. So UK, Luxembourg, the US, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. I think that was 7, hopefully, Keith. And that will become maybe a little bit important later on when we start to talk about the specifics of carried interest. So that's probably like a little bit about the firm. And if anything else that you wanted to ask, Keith?
No, that's good. I might come back briefly again on the research and the deal-by-deal carry versus whole-of-fund carry.
Sure.
But Giuliano, do you want to maybe talk a bit about your house and what you do?
Yeah, so BC Partners. So BC Partners is a UK headquartered private equity. So since 1986. We are present in Luxembourg in 1999. So BC Partners at the beginning was a pure private equity like Cinven, but we started in, I would say, 2016, and then on the credit side, and then in 2019 on the real estate. So in Luxembourg, we serve the 3 asset classes, meaning private equity, real estate, and credit. We have our own IFM, and so we increase as well the numbers of headcounts, which is at least very, very good for Luxembourg. So carry, yes, definitely is a kind of topic which is very interesting. I would say carry is a kind of a retention of the people, but we have to be in mind carry is linked to the performance of the fund. So meaning that if the fund is not performing, so your carry is basically close to 0. So, yeah.
Yeah, okay, and maybe we'll come back to that, the whole operational side of carry and how it works and is it effective. But I just thought it was interesting, Ed, you were pointing out you go for whole fund carry. And one of the pieces of research I was referring to, there was one in 2013 and one in 2022. And one of the things the researchers were trying to do is to say, well, to determine is carry effective, what do we compare to? And obviously there's no private equity funds out there really with no carry, which in itself is a message. But what they did actually look at was compared deal-by-deal carry, which they concluded was more GP friendly, and then tried to see, does that correlate to higher performance? And their answer seemed to be, it does seem to, and it at least pays for the extra cost to the LPs. So it tends to indicate that not only is carry effective, but sometimes even increasing it is even more effective. But let's use that as a segue into looking at how in practice you see carried interest, leaving aside all the tax parts of it, but within your firms, what influence does it have? How important is it? You touched, Giuliano, I think, on a really important point, which is retention. Because I know when LPs are doing due diligence, it's one of the things they really look at hard. They say, what's your team? What's the stability? There's key men clauses in there. And they're very concerned about this. So maybe, Giuliano, do you want to start off just elaborating a bit on that? For BC Partners, for example, how important do you think carry is to make the whole thing operate? And what effects does it have on day-to-day and more long-term operations?
Really the key is keeping the people, because just an example on private equity. So the deal team, they are acquiring target companies. So, and it's very important to keep a kind of a retention of the deal team, because the idea behind is really, if we buy a company, the idea is to to make it more profitable, to maybe change how they operate, to make it work better, etc. And so having the same people on the deal team which was involved in the acquisition as well during the lifetime that you keep the asset on your portfolio, and then selling it. So that's really, and there it's an advantage to say, okay, if you do perform well, if you change the operation of the company and to make it better, more profitable, and that you sell it with which is at the end of the day what the PE house is doing, buying, upgrading, doing more performant, and then selling with a capital gain to a return of our investors. So having a deal team which is stable, always the same, it's very important. And there it's entering the carry interest. It's really a kind of retention. And who knows, as well, to hire other person which we see that are more, which can fit in our strategy. So it's a kind of retaining and attracting talent. So.
Ed, I mean, same question. And
let me try and add a little bit on the Cinven side as well. So I think that's right, and retaining talent through generations to kind of create succession in the firm as well. I mean that's important. We at Cinven we went through a managing partner transition last year, excuse me, and we went from 1 managing partner to 3. And those 3 managing partners all came from the firm. They'd all been in the firm a long time. So, and I think the other thing is maybe like to stand back a little bit and look at the wider package that private equity funds produce. Carried interest is for me the kind of long-term, personal view, long-term component of it with long vesting periods. So it is about retention, and it does involve significant amounts of money. But you've also got in there, you've got the annual management fees that are kind of paying the cost of the business, and you've got the point around co-investment, that these people are also being asked to be significant investors in the funds that we raise. And you have to look at those things together. And actually, maybe even to take it a step further, maybe even the kind of life cycle of a private equity executive. You grow up and you're perhaps awarded some carry. That feels great. But then you're also being asked to co-invest. The funds that we have at Cinven, and it's probably the same for you, Giuliano, they're kind of highly illiquid. So it's not until the later stages of the fund that you will be generating the proceeds and the liquidity. So again, that challenge of being able to fund co-investment, you've got to put it all together. It's actually quite a compelling package that covers the short, the medium, and the long term, and is aligning the interests of the people in our firm with those of our investors. So, I mean, I'm a GP, so I'm always going to say this, Keith, but I think it's incredibly important. And without that long-term incentive, what have you got? Okay, so there are businesses out there in private equity that are listed and have a more liquid currency, but most of us don't. So without that, how do you generate that long-term incentive? I think it's hugely important.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, to pick up on a couple of points that you mentioned there, one is, is it effective in keeping teams? It's interesting, some of the research that was done on this, I dug a little bit further to try and figure out where they got the data sets. And when you look, you see that they actually got them from some very large LPs who obviously gave them access to all their historic investments and their track records. So they were able to follow this as the first point. The second point is obviously the big LPs are asking themselves exactly this question. Is this effective? Does it work? But there was also, as an interesting kind of counterfactual, I know we were discussing this before, Ed, and you were saying, is it effective as a retention tool? And you were saying if you put yourself on the other side of it and you try to hire from another competitor. Do you want to explain your counterfactual kind of there?
Yeah, it's an interesting conundrum because that it is a very effective long-term retention. And if you think about that executive that's further on in the journey, they've been through a few funds, they're a bit more liquid in their co-investment, they're going to be asked for more money every time if the fund's successful to go into the next fund and the next fund. So you can build up, what is quite a kind of war chest of value in the firm. And the idea of losing that if you go to another firm is something that's quite difficult. And if you're matching that against the cyclical nature of these businesses, if you're trying to kind of hire somebody mid-cycle into a fund, have you got have you got the foresight and the plan and the strategy around carried interest to have that available? And then structurally, can you deliver it? What's it worth? All those kind of things. So it's an interesting conflict, Keith, that you raise, which is now making me squirm a bit. So it's obviously a good question.
Yeah, and I think it shows that maybe not at an academic level, but at a very practical level, you can say, yes, if you want to try and hire somebody out of one of those organizations, it's bloody difficult. That would seem to imply that the carry as a retention tool is very effective. But let's maybe move on a little bit now to the tax side of this. And as anyone who's in Luxembourg has probably read, or anybody who follows tax more broadly, there was a recent proposal to introduce, let's call it a clarification and upgrade to the existing carried interest law in Luxembourg. And Giuliano, as the head of the tax group in the LPEA, would you like to talk us through this? And I think we have a slide. If whoever out there is doing slides, could you put that up, please?
I don't find the click. I just missed the, Johan, the click. Yeah, otherwise I cannot put
Or just go to the next slide, perhaps. Here we go.
Okay, so as you I've noticed before the summer period, there has been a draft bill on the carried interest that has been issued, and which was very welcome by the industry in Luxembourg. First of all, because it gave some clarification. Just as a small history, the carry regime was already introduced in 2013 with the IFMD directive. It was only for people coming from abroad. It was only limited in time, and when it stopped, the law was still in the carried interest regime, tax regime was still in the law, but it came with confusion, meaning that for some it was clear, for some others it was a kind of gray zone. So at the end of the day, if you would ask some tax advisors to give you an opinion, he would give you receive at the end 3 different comments how the carry regime should, or how the taxation of the carry should be in Luxembourg. Saying that, so I think that was the motivation to have some clarification as well from the Ministry of Finance to give some clarification on the carried interest regime. And the idea is really behind to attract and to keep talent. So, and when we read the draft bill, so the idea was really of, we believe, of the Ministry of Finance is to cover all the most situation of carry in Luxembourg. So, and if you see, there is, I would say, two main differentiation that we have to make. The first one, as you see in the slide, I would say it's a pure contractual carried interest regime. So meaning that the asset manager conclude a contract with people working in the alternative investment industry, in the GP, and then depending if it's a whole of fund or deal by deal, it will receive then the carry-on. The taxation is there a quarter of rate, which is not new. It was already in the law when it was introduced in 2013. But they have gone move forward because they say, okay, you can still have a contractual carry interest regime, but if you do an investment like an LP, you do an investment in your fund, so a kind of equity investment, but still contractual, that is as well covered in the bill, and there your taxation would be then 0%. So it is very, the amount to be invested has not been defined in the bill, but we know that it will not be 10 euros. So there is still a minimum to be invested in a fund. So that would say that's the contractual carried interest, which, and I'm happy that you share, but it's, I would say, the least common carry scheme plan that you will see for private equity houses. The most common one is the next slide. If someone can help me to put the next slide. That would be great. You have to. So that's the invested carry, or in equity-linked carried interest. So is the GP or the sponsor will ask you, okay, you are eligible to invest in the carry vehicle. And there you have to do an investment. You have to really, and that's the way we say in equity linked. So you invest into the carry vehicle. So that's the most common, I would say, carry interest scheme that you will see. And then depending on what you have, the performance of the fund, if you have repaid the hurdle rate, if your carry vehicle is in carry, so then you receive the carry investment. And there it's really the clarification is that if you held it for 6 months and you have less than 10%, so the carry that you receive is tax exempt. So you can have as well a carry investment in the carry vehicle. You can as well do an investment as a normal limited partner in your fund, and there the law clearly stipulates what is the taxation of your carry investment, what is taxation of your co-investment. So, and that's what you will see more and more, or I would say that's already what is in the market, and it's, I would say, the most common carried interest scheme that you will see. And that has been very welcomed by the industry, because as of I would say yesterday, before the draft bill has been published, it was still in the gray zone. Now it's really easy, it's simple, it gives clarity. The law has been beyond. We know that it has increased the eligible of the person who can benefit from the carry, even though the State Council has issued yesterday that it should be more precise of the person that can benefit from the carry, but I think that, that's very bad. It's a comment which I think they are working now on that, but and that's what you will see in the market. I don't know, Ed, if you want to add some more points on that, or what is at similar level.
Yeah, no, thanks, Giuliano. No, I think you covered it all very, very, very well.
But maybe, Ed, I mean, from your perspective, I think what would be interesting for everyone to hear is you were saying I deal with 7 different jurisdictions already. I mean, we could say, if we were putting in scholastic terms, putting on my academic hat, the Conseil d'État has now marked the homework of the drafters of the law. And by the way, I think the Conseil d'État gave them a 9 out of 10 if I look at the comment they made. If you were comparing it to carried regimes in other countries, how would you rate the Luxembourg regime?
Great question. All right. This might take a while. Well, the first thing, there's one point, before I do it, there's one point I wanted to pick up on, actually, that Giuliano mentioned earlier. If you haven't seen these kind of structure charts before, you might be kind of saying, well, why is it all so complicated? So the reason it's complicated is because the rules are complicated. And then if you've got 7 different countries, they've all got 7 completely different carried interest regimes. And if your objective is to qualify in each local country for each of those 7 carried interest regimes, you just end up with a bit of complexity. And there's a similar exercise that kind of happens at the fund level. So I just wanted to preface on complexity, because it's important, it's apparent here. I think the actual business structure of private equity is quite straightforward. I mean, you summed it up perfectly. We buy assets, we create value, and we sell them, and we put them in funds. But structurally, we're very complicated businesses. And part of it is to do with the fact that these regimes are complex. Right, now to get on to the actual question, which is how do I rate the Lux regime against others? So I think the headline rates speak for themselves, so I don't think I need to say anything about that. But what I did want to labour on a little bit was you need to go a little bit deeper.
Just maybe for the benefit of the audience, so the headline rates would basically be your downside case is between 10 and 12%. And your base case should be basically an exempt capital gain, like other capital gains of a similar type in Luxembourg. So the headline rates, yes, you're right, are pretty good.
Yeah, so it's a very competitive regime. But that's not what it's all about. You know, headline rates are important, But if you're sat in my position, taxpayer certainty is incredibly important. You remember I told you these funds go on for 10 years. These businesses can't really change very much once funds are raised. So having certainty is important. And I think this regime is excellent because it's got simple entry conditions. It's pretty agnostic as to the structure of your fund, which I've just told you can get really complicated. And that might sound like a simple thing, but it's not. It's really important. And I think that added to the headline rates is what makes this really compelling. I'll decline giving it a score out of 10 there, but I think you can kind of see where I'm going. And then in terms of the other jurisdictions, because I think this is helpful for context for people. So some other jurisdictions aren't doing this. So some of the jurisdictions don't have carried interest regimes. I'm very lucky that the 7 countries that Cinven operates in does have them. Some of these countries didn't have them until recently. Spain didn't have a carried interest tax regime until 2023. It's quite recent. I'm not in Belgium, but Belgium's only just got one. And then some of the lessons learned from other jurisdictions that I think have been kind of avoided in this regime. And I'm sorry to pick on France, but I kind of have to here. So the French regime, the entry conditions are very much based around what domestic French funds look like. So I don't want to get too much into structure. I can do, but I don't want to. But if you're a global fund with a complicated global fund structure, you are not going to qualify for the French carried interest regime by accident. You really need to think about it and structure in. This regime doesn't have that problem. Actually, neither does the UK one. That problem was avoided there, but the UK has other issues. And the other issues really are, in the UK, the government has taken a different view. So we've had a carried interest regime in the UK for a long time. It's been reformed. I mean, I think I've been in discussions now 3 times in my long career of reforming it. And this time, they actually want to tax carried interest as income, but at a hybrid rate. And again, that's been difficult because you've created a regime that's structure agnostic. That's OK. You've given taxpayer certainty. That's OK. You've tried to set a flat rate, which is similar to having a qualifying rate and a non-qualifying rate. In the UK, it's 34% and 47%. But you've created a lot of complexity around international mobility and how that's dealt with. And also, they've tried to extend the taxing rights to some non-residents, which is quite a unique feature of the UK regime. So the UK regime has actually become much less competitive recently. And the dangerous bend for anybody who's working in the UK and has carried interest is if you're spending more than 60 days there on an ongoing basis, then you could become chargeable in the UK to tax on carried interest. So that's a very different picture to what's happening here in Luxembourg. Okay? And then one more that I'll mention is Germany, which has had rules for a long time, but they're very out of date. If you're going to set rules, tax rules, that depend on the structure of your private equity fund, then you need to keep it up to date, otherwise it ceases to be relevant and you get strange answers and difficult corner cases, and that comes through in complexity. So there's nothing kind of technically wrong with the regime, but it needs to be kept up to date. I have a similar fear in the UK for the non-qualifying regime. And that's the other thing, is the element of jeopardy in terms of meeting the qualifying conditions or not and where you end up. So none of those features, I think, are really materialized in the Luxembourg regime, and that's why I would argue that it's a really solid regime.
Yeah, I think and I fully agree with you, Ed. It might look simple, but our business is very complex. And when reading the bill of the carried interest, and Keith, correct me if I'm wrong, but really the idea when reading was, let's keep it simple. Let's keep it simple. It's already a very complex business. If we are going to complexify as well the tax regime of the carried interest, that would not be really worthwhile, or for Luxembourg would not make any sense. And really, when reading, I think really the idea behind was keep it simple.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think you could look at the commentary from the Council of State, which is kind of our body that reviews laws in Luxembourg, And if they completely agree you don't need a second reading in Parliament, if they have a reserve, you either change it or you need a second reading in Parliament. Their one comment was almost around saying this piece of law is too simple. It says, used the term au service, and they said that could have too broad a meaning, potentially creating legal uncertainty. You could agree or disagree, but I think probably the government will make a tweak to it. But we now have about 5 minutes left, and maybe let's talk a little bit about looking forward. What are the likely consequences of this law and effects, bearing in mind that as it was presented, the intention was to attract more what people often refer to as front office or senior people to Luxembourg. From the initial reactions you've seen, do you think that's going to be effective? What do you see as the likely consequences looking forward 3-5 years' time?
If you look today, the PE houses, the evolution of PE houses was from back office, we are now middle office. The idea is really to attract a front office, but as well investor relation. Will that come from today to tomorrow? I have no crystal ball, but having such a carry interest regime will definitely help. But it is not the only thing which needs to be paid attention, and because so the LPEA has conducted a survey, and the survey, the outcome of the survey is very positive. So people are happy. They say it's too good to be true. But there are other aspects to be considered: education, housing, school, airport. So that's other factors that needs to be taken into consideration in the future if Luxembourg really want to really attract senior management, a deal team, and investor relation to Luxembourg. But it's already a very positive point, having the carried interest. Luxembourg is working as well on education, housing, but it doesn't need to stop now just because we have a clear carried interest regime.
Yeah, thanks, Giuliano. I agree with that. I wouldn't expect a big bang overnight, but I think a building of conviction over time. I think that's what it is. And I think we should also pause and celebrate the other things where Luxembourg's been very successful. So the AIFM regime, I can remember back in 2013 being sat in London structuring one of the first Luxembourg funds and trying to kind of Luxify all these UK partnership agreements. You think how far we've come there. And even for a business like Cinven, so our flagship funds are UK based. But I should have mentioned, we've got a Lux AIFM, and it's a very important part of our strategy to be able to kind of access the European market. So I think that component shouldn't be understated, and the success that Luxembourg has had there as well. So I think you're right, Giuliano. It's kind of multifactorial. Don't expect a big bang, but I think over time you will see movement, and the stage is set.
Yeah, I also in my day job I see this very often. Individuals are considering where to locate, and they definitely look at taxation of carry in the private equity industry. Occasionally, for new operations, when they're being located, private equity houses do also look at it and say locating a team. But I think it's absolutely right. It doesn't mean tomorrow there's going to be big front office teams are going to shift to Luxembourg. I don't think that's realistic. But on a similar panel a few weeks ago, there was a large private equity fund tax director, and he was saying, listen, what I can tell you is that in a country where there's a bad regime, we will take a decision not to locate more people there because our teams are getting more and more regionally based. So before, the German deal teams were in Germany, the French teams were in France. Now we're asking them to be more industry focused so they can choose where they sit within reason. And he said, same thing, we're not going to move tomorrow, 10 deal makers to Luxembourg, but he said over time, some of them definitely will move here. And he said also, when we choose where we're going to invest our front office functions, clearly having a bad regime is just a no-no. And then after that, we decide where people end up. I'm conscious of our time here, which is actually, it looks red and it says 10, yeah, it's going up now. So just some closing remarks within maximum 20 seconds. Otherwise, there's a gentleman over here who'll be very unhappy. Ed, do you want to kick off closing remarks?
Not much from me. I just wanted to thank LPEA for the invitation to the conference, actually. I think it's a wonderful event, and hopefully you'll invite me back.
Certainly. Giuliano.
Definitely as a GP, reading such a draft bill, you can only be happy. And thanks you all to assist to this panel. I hope it was very enlightening, and maybe let's see what the future brings us to Luxembourg.
Thank you, and thank you all. A round of applause for my panel members. Thank you.